Hi, my name is Eric Wong. I head up marketing intelligence for Atumos. And as Sydney already mentioned, we, of course, deployed this data marketing intelligence survey via the MOPsPROs community probably about a month ago, I want to say. And we gave you guys a week and a half to 2 weeks to complete the survey. Uh, First of all, I want to thank every single one of you that participated in the survey and for providing us with this information that we can analyze. And of course, for everyone that showed up today for the readout as well. So the agenda today is actually going to be very simple, pretty straightforward. I'm going to outline some of the key findings. We're going to drill into the key findings and kind of the different pivots and slices that make up some of those larger overviews that I'm seeing. And then, of course, we'll wrap it all up, and I have some recommendations on how to make all of us a little more data-driven as a community. Before we go any further into the actual data, I do want to give you guys a sense of the people that participated. Once again, thank you very much for those of you that participated in the survey and giving us this data to work with. The sample size that we ended up with was 86 responses, and that's approximately 5% of the MOPsPROs population. It would have been better to have more. It's always better to have more data. That said, 86 responses is plenty for us to draw some conclusions as well as extrapolate some of the findings that we found here. So that's absolutely appropriate. I do want to give you guys a sense of kind of the profile of the people that we did end up getting information from. So out of those 86 responses, we had a majority, a pretty overwhelming majority of you are actually in the technology industry, so 67%. So that means about a third of you are in this other bucket. And the reason why I categorize it as this other bucket is largely because the other 33% really are onesies and twosies from various different industries. It's really hard for us, when you have one response, two responses representing a whole industry, for us to really draw any extrapolation of how they function. And so I didn't spend a lot of time breaking out the industries. Just know that the other 33% represent onesies and twosies, banking, healthcare, consultancies, as well as various other industries out there. That said, as far as the rest of kind of the profiles that we saw, as you can see here, we've got 16% with 100 or fewer people in company size, 38% in 101 to 500, 51% or 16% in 501 to 1,000, and 29% in 1,001 and more people. Now, that gives us a pretty good kind of spread across the board in terms of the different representations of company sizes, right? Like, we've got a good representation from both the enterprise side as well as the SMB side, which is great. Respondent roles, as you can see, there are a couple of key personas that we're really seeing here, not the least of which is the MOPS generalist, 44% of us that responded. That's not surprising, right? Given kind of what we know about the community, and especially what we know about MOPS in general, which is that many of us wear multiple hats, right? And so having more of the MOPS generalists in this group makes sense. What I was a little surprised about is actually the 37% that self-identified as marketing leaders. So typically that's going to be your directors, VPs, CMOs, whatnot, people that head up different disciplines and functions within the marketing department. So 37%. It is worthwhile to note, however, that the 37% that you see here, most of those people, I'd say probably upwards of like 85%, also wore multiple hats. So really a more accurate description of the marketing leader pillar here is actually marketing leader generalists as well, because they handle multiple things. They manage technology, they manage processes, they manage analytics, whatnot. And so it's just an interesting thing to see here. And then from the operational structure perspective, not surprising, we're seeing 74% of us are in kind of what I would consider more of a traditional revenue operation structures, meaning you've got separate MOPs and SOPs disciplines, right? So marketing operations is managed, by a very distinct group, and sales operations is managed by a separate group. 16% of us are in kind of unified RevOps roles or RevOps organizations. I did for some time start seeing a trend, especially in smaller companies, where they would do that. This isn't growing, this percentage isn't growing quite as quickly as I expected. That said, there is representation there. And of course, we've got 7% in just purely MOPS only. And I tend to think in those roles, you're kind of probably still a little bit of a mix, right? MOPS and SOPs, or MOPS RevOps, whatever you want to call it. And then 2% with really no operational team at all. So on to the findings, right? And there are three key buckets of findings that we ended up with. The first is data-driven culture. Second is people and process, technology and data. Pretty self-explanatory as far as how they're categorized, but the first, data-driven culture, being one thing that I found is 49% of the MOPsPROs community self-identified as working in a data-driven organization. That's great. Like about half of us, that is actually a little higher than I expected, which is great, right? That's a pleasant surprise. That said, this is a marketing operations audience. So one of the things that we did, there were 4 questions within the questionnaire that we sent out that were meant to give a behavioral indicator of whether or not we would find the organization or the practices to be data-driven. And so after scoring it and kind of comparing this against the 49% of MOPsPROs self-identifying, we found only 34% of the MOPsPROs community demonstrated sort of objectively data-driven behaviors, right? And so there is a slight gap between self-identified as being data-driven as well as what we would consider data-driven behaviors based on the questionnaire. We'll go a little bit deeper into that. Next, we've got people in process. 74% of companies have traditional, as I mentioned before, separate, right, MOPS and SOPs functions, which is not surprising. However, what is surprising, or rather what's a little bit concerning, is even though 74% of us inherently have different org structures, meaning alignment is that much more important, only 45% of us reported having strong KPI alignment between marketing and sales. And so as you can see, there's a little bit of a gap, right? When you have separate organizations, alignment between the organizations become that much more important. And so there's a little bit of a gap there, and that's a little bit of a concern. And then finally, technology and data. 55% of MOPsPROs have no access to any multi-touch attribution capabilities. And there's no comparison there. And 33% still report primarily out of spreadsheets. The numbers themselves don't surprise me. That said, it is a little disheartening to see that a third of us are still primarily using, Excel, Google Sheets to do our reporting. What that indicates to me is that there's still a lot of potential, right? A lot of potential for the data, for people to activate their data and really make smarter and better data-driven decisions in their day-to-day activities. And the other 66% is heading down that path. I'm going to pause here real quick, just in case anyone have any questions on just kind of the intro slides here. Feel free to unmute yourself if you have any questions. If not, then we'll move on.
Joe Mar said in the chat that he thinks a lot of people don't know the difference between lead source and last touch. I think that's very painfully true. That's what Rachel said also. Eric, have you seen that kind of anecdotally, that people are using lead source versus last touch differently or in a way that's not really significant or accurate?
So actually, I didn't see the question. Could you clarify for me what you mean by lead source versus last touch? Meaning like
lead source being like the channel that generated someone as net new into your database, and last touch being just the last thing that they interacted with.
Got it. Well, so I guess part of that depends on how you architect your system, right? How you architect the data capture. I don't think that, at least based on my experience, I don't think that there is necessarily a concrete definition between the two, because a lot of people use lead source as, implicitly first touch, but then a lot of people use lead source in combinations of ways that look at, the channel the channel of the first touch versus kind of the offer of the first touch, right? And so it really depends on what's important to your company, what data you're using to drive your decisions, and ultimately how you're architecting your system to capture that data. But yes, absolutely. There absolutely needs to be kind of definitions alignment in any organization. I wouldn't say it needs to be universal across the board, but it needs to be consistent within the organization to make sure that you have the best use of your data.
Yeah, totally. Jomar, you also had a question about customer data. Do you want to expand on that a little bit? You can unmute yourself.
Yeah, I feel like customer data is to me is the most important because we do a lot of upsells and cross sells in my organization. However, it's becoming more apparent that a lot of the data isn't centralized. It's like a lot of, there's a lot of decentralized data sets because of course they're communicating in other forms besides just like Salesforce, right? And so there's all these decentralized data sets, and I feel like there's not enough focus because a lot of people are, trying to always acquire new types of business, but we focus more on upsells and cross sells because we only work with billion-dollar companies. So it's like, I think that's more prevalent to me now, how important it is to have customer data and centralizing that customer data. And right now I'm working on a few startups that are centralizing that data sets, but I don't see that being more talked about in our community quite yet.
Yeah, and customer data is always tricky, right? Because many of us, particularly in tech, tend to work in SaaS. And so you have a lot of data capture that's going on there. And they're not, to your point, going into, or at least not fully going into your Salesforce or Marketo instances. That said, there's no reason why you can't, through Webhooks or some other integration, propagate at least the most important data, right, into your Salesforce instance, into your Marketo instance, so that you can make business decisions as well as, trigger off of these data points to communicate to your customers. Now, from a trending standpoint, I would say, if you have vast quantities of data that you need to deal with in terms of customer data, customer behavior data, what you typically see in that situation is, people start really heavily investing in either a CDP of sorts or just kind of a traditional data repository, whether it be a data lake or a data warehouse, something to bring all of that together and to bring in, not just your marketing data, but your sales data and also your customer data, so that you can reconcile it and push it back out, ideally, to your operational system so that you can make some of these decisions. That really is, to date, the kind of most comprehensive way of doing it.
Yeah, well, I noticed, sorry to interrupt. I feel like right now what I've been doing is I found a few startups that I really like, and they're mostly in the utility space and how they're actually using the data, their customer data quite well. And then I plug it into a predictive modeling tool that I have. And then because then the multi-touch attribution, it does capture the campaigns, the marketing campaigns, after they become, a customer. However, I still want the attributes of what type of, demographic or firmographic information are coming from that. So I plug it into my predictive modeling tool. And then I plug it into, I try to centralize the data as best I can. However, it's the sales process in terms of other forms of channels of communication that they have is still a bit hard for me to capture. So I think that's the part, because I want to put that into a predictive modeling tool to understand how many touches does it take to get an upselling cross-sell, and what type of additional campaigns did we partner up with. Because there's not that many billion-dollar companies out there, but if there is, I want to know what type of industries and what type of what type of messaging works really well with them, right?
That makes sense. I think, and I'm just going to spend a really brief moment answering this question, and I'd like to actually move on to the next couple of slides before we stop for more questions. But just to address what you just mentioned, I think part of this is a process issue, right? Because a tool like Salesforce, especially if you integrate with other tools like Outreach or whatnot, has the ability to track all that sales process, all the sales activities, with a fair amount of detail and granularity. Now, that said, if people aren't adhering to processes, that's an issue. You're not going to have the data, right? I tend to think that if you are connecting to your Salesforce instance and there's process governance in place, it actually, you'd be surprised at how rich the data is, the activities data and the process data that you could get if architected correctly coming out of Salesforce. Okay, so I'm gonna pause the questions here and go ahead and move forward with this. So the next few sections is really deep diving into some of these high level metrics and insights that I saw. And so first and foremost, data-driven culture, right? As you saw before, 49% of MOPsPROs self-identify as working in a data-driven organization, but only 34% demonstrate data-driven behaviors. Now, what does that mean? Well, so I mentioned to you earlier, right, that we took kind of a lead scoring, behavior scoring approach to score and identify people that exhibited data-driven behaviors. These are the 4 questions that were in the survey. Now, if you recall, the survey had 25 total questions. Of them, I took one from each of these areas, right? People, process, technology, and data. Now, you could argue these aren't necessarily the most representative, and in your particular case, it may not be relevant. That's okay. The whole point of this, like any lead scoring exercise, behavior scoring exercise, is to get a directional gauge of whether or not we find these people or these organizations to be data-driven. And some of the analysis that I put in place did find that there was a high level of correlation between this and, for example, the people that self-reported as data-driven. Now, you'll notice, of course, that between the behavior score and self-reported being 49% of us, reported being data-driven, with the behavior score is 34%. What does that mean? Well, that means 15% of us are lying. No, actually, that's not the case. I did a regression analysis against this, and the data points, while the breakout is slightly different, it actually came out with a high level of correlation. As a matter of fact, they both came out with a high level of correlation against the one other self-identified question I put in there as well, which is, are most of my marketing intelligence needs being met, right? Both the behavior scored flag of being data-driven as well as the self-reported one correlated very highly to your marketing intelligence needs being met. That means that if you identified as data-driven or you scored as data-driven, the chances are you're pretty satisfied with your marketing intelligence. Now, all of this went into a multivariate regression engine. And basically, the whole point of this was to see out of those other 20 or so questions, what popped, right? Like what were some of the key correlations or some of the key patterns that emerged for people that exhibited data-driven behavior or self-reported as data-driven. And actually, out of all of the 20 questions that I threw in there, a couple of key things actually did pop up as highly correlated with whether or not a company or an organization is data-driven. The first was only relevant to the behavior scored version, right? So the first is basically the company size. The larger the company, the more likely that you are to be data-driven. Specifically, companies with 1,001 or more employees were 2.2 times as likely to be data-driven as those with 500 or fewer. Now, I looked at that, looked a little deeper, and there was a little bit of bias in there. Look at the first question, right? How many analysts do you have supporting marketing? Generally speaking, I know we have a fair number of enterprise kind of size people here as well, but generally speaking, you have to be at a certain point of maturity before you can invest in analysts. And so, because of that bias, I kind of threw that out. Now that said, there was one other key question and key indicator that aligned very closely to whether people are behaviorally scored as data-driven or self-reported as data-driven, and that's marketing and sales KPI alignment. So what do I mean by that? Now, what I found is that organizations with KPI alignment is between marketing and sales were 1.7 times as likely to exhibit very data-driven behaviors. they're 4 times as likely to exhibit at least somewhat data-driven behaviors. And you can kind of see where that calculation comes from. They're also 2.1 times as likely to self-report as at least somewhat data-driven. So what that tells me is that kind of getting a data-driven culture starts with marketing and sales KPI alignment. That's nothing super controversial. That's nothing that, you know, we all haven't heard before, right? But seeing that in the data, seeing that emerge as through regression as being correlated with, you know, both our scoring as well as people self-reporting as data-driven, that's something a little more interesting. Now, there are other behaviors, right, that also correlate with this, or at the very least are related to this, right? We're also seeing that organizations with KPI alignment between marketing and sales were 3 times or 3.3 times as likely to have at least monthly business reviews. Now, what does that mean? Well, you know, some of these behaviors are, they kind of go hand in hand, right? Obviously, if marketing and sales agree on a set of metrics, they're going to want to come to this table to determine, hey, you know what, is marketing doing everything that they need to do to fill the top of the funnel with leads? Is sales doing everything they need to do to follow up with those leads, right? And so you kind of have a vested interest when you have an organizational alignment and KPI alignment across your funnel between multiple orgs. Now, the problem with that is if you look at the portion of people that actually have strong marketing sales KPI alignment based on the responses, only about half of us, right? 45% of us. And if you recall from one of the earlier stats, 74% of us have separate marketing and sales operations organizations, right? And so really, we're only talking about half, a little less than half of these split organizations have strong KPI alignment, which is a gap. Now, if you recall, we also talked about some, I also asked you guys some kind of attitudinal questions around, you know, what are some of the key pain points that you saw around, you know, reaching a data-driven state, right? And here's what we saw. These are some of the themes. It's representative in general. Obviously, I didn't have room to put everything in here, right? But these are 4 quotes verbatim that I felt like were pretty representative of what we saw. Leadership alignment was an issue. Prioritization was an issue. Executive support, which kind of goes into leadership alignment. And really, it's political will, right? Because the last one you see here, we're able to report on a lot of stuff, but the team doesn't really use data to make decisions. So really, it's, yeah, even when you have the capabilities, people aren't using it, whether it's politics or it's just distrust of the data. Any number of those things could cause that problem, right? Now, what I found that typically work well, or at least help gain traction in that area, is to overcome this with very specific, very small efforts of actionable insights and recommendations. And towards the end, I can talk through specifically how we do that. But at a high level, things like, hey, you know what? Instead of just looking at your funnel, looking at the next click down, right? Like the slices of your funnel that actually matter. You're looking at conversion, you're looking at velocity, but what about conversion by first touch lead source, right? What about conversion by, you know, different slices and dices that really get down to the nitty gritty of how our marketers are pulling levers to execute on their marketing activities, right? And so getting down to that level and getting down to real recommendations around, hey, you know what? The paid media efforts that you're doing is potentially converting more slowly or at a lower rate than some of the other channels. That's a very specific insight and recommendation that you could pass along. And hopefully over time that will build credibility as well as build kind of a more data-driven culture. Now, before I dive into the next slide, I'm going to pause here again. Are there any other questions based on what we've talked about so far? Let's see.
I think there's been some general agreement about the lack of executive sponsorship being a big blocker to being data-driven.
Yeah, I'm scrolling through this here.
Data literacy, a lot of conversations and leadership without people who actually are close to the data.
Yep, and actually, some of this I'll be touching on in the next section with the people and process piece as well, and kind of where you make the investments. They say data is only beneficial if it meets their agenda. If it don't, then it's fake news. Yeah, that happens a lot, as a matter of fact. And as a matter of fact, one of the barriers that you see a lot, right, to getting marketing and sales with KPI alignment is not the actual alignment. Like generally speaking, funnel metrics are pretty pretty easy to get behind, but the first 2 months or first 2 weeks or 2 months of your conversations invariably fall to who has the correct data, right? Why is marketing showing 1,000 leads when sales is only showing 500 leads? Because 500 of those leads either don't have an assignment to a sales rep, or they fall into a black hole, they're in the wrong status. But this ends up being kind of the plague of marketing and sales alignment, particularly on the data front. All I can say is, in general, if you're just kind of diligent and push through it, and you try to get different data sources to show the data correctly, do the digging, eventually you can come out on the other end. Okay, I'm gonna move on. So the next section that we have are people and process, right? As you recall, 74% of companies have traditional marketing ops and sales ops functions, yet only 45% have strong KPI alignment between marketing and sales. I already touched on why KPI alignment between marketing and sales is important, right? So let's dive into some of the crosstabs and some of the reasons for that. So, as I already mentioned, right, marketing and sales alignment is more important than ever, and it all starts with the KPIs. Now, you already saw, right, only 45% have strong KPI alignment. Once again, 74% have separate marketing and sales operations teams, so that's a bit of a problem. That's a disconnect, right? We also see that a very small percentage of people, not large by any stretch of the imagination, but a small percentage of people don't sufficiently review their data, right? And so what I mean by that is that, as you can see there, 25%, like a quarter of the respondents, don't have any kind of a structured, regular sync, whether it's monthly, quarterly, or weekly. And then another 15% only meet on a quarterly basis, which means, if you look at it, how often are you changing strategies or tactics, right, in your typical marketing organization? Being only quarterly really means you're looking back in the rear view to see, hey, report back on what happened. You're not necessarily making real-time optimizations and changes, right? So really, at the end of the day, only about 60% of us have some sort of operational process that allows us to be data-driven and actually, make business decisions as a result of the data that we're seeing. And here's some of the other behaviors that we're seeing, right? So linear regression didn't indicate a strong correlation with this, between this and being data-driven, right? Whether it's behavior scored or self-reported, that's okay, because visually you can still kind of see a pattern emerge here, right? For example, if you look up in the upper left, over 3 times, people that scored as behaviorally data-driven were 3 times as likely to meet at least monthly to discuss their funnel metrics. And even people that were self-reported, right, 69%, 4 to 5 times as likely to meet at least on a monthly basis. And really, at the end of the day, regardless of whether your behavioral, we call you data-driven because of the activities that you have or behavior that you have, or we call you data-driven because you're self-reported. The point is that, meeting to align on these metrics, aligning on the metrics, and then meeting to discuss the metrics on a regular basis so that you can make decisions is a key to being data-driven as an organization. Now let's look at the budgeting, right? For people that were scored as data-driven, they're 26 times as likely to base their budgets on historical performance. For self-reported people, it was 6 times as likely that their marketing budgets were directly correlated with historical performance. Now, if you look at, forget about the 26 times and the 6 times, right? Like just the budgeting behavioral score perspective, almost 80% of the people that are highly data driven base their budgets on their historical performance, which kind of makes sense, right? Because you're doubling down on what works, and maybe you're divesting in areas that don't work. And that's kind of the epitome of being more data driven. And so what I wanted to do was also to explore, right, what were some of the blockers to keep people from having KPI alignment, from being more data driven in kind of their processes. And so this was these were some of the comments that came about, right? And so left to right, you'll see time constraints to set up and analyze data. The manual processes take time to consolidate, right? No real marketing intelligence structure. Nobody owns marketing intelligence. Few understand how complex it is. And there were a lot more comments in here about how, you know, we're understaffed, under-resourced, we don't have the expertise, we don't have the data scientists or the analysts, right? These are just a few of the examples, but in general, they all kind of fall into the same bucket, right? And what does that mean? Well, when I look at this, I see that most organizations, or many organizations, are underinvested when it comes to, you know, people, right? And this is typically where you start, right? You have to, like, from an organizational and, you know, from an organizational standpoint, typically you kind of have to, like what I was saying earlier, start with the little steps, right? Make very concrete, specific recommendations to get buy-in, to get people to be a little more data-driven. And then when it comes time to scale, when it comes time to specialize, you really need to start investing in the people. What I mean by people is, you know, you need to start thinking about hiring an analyst. It doesn't mean it has to be a specialized analyst that you bring in-house from outside. It could be someone that evolves into an analyst role, but you do need to have that skill set, someone who understands the data, someone who understands how to bring it together so that you can tap into the power of your data and get the most out of it. I'm gonna pause here and see if we have any additional questions here.
Julie had a question. Julie, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and talk a little more about it, about behavior scoring and how it plays with a full ABM model.
Well, I can just respond. Julie, did you have anything to add to that, or? I'll just respond to that then. So I don't see those two as being separate, right? A full ABM model will still be dependent on some level of behavioral scoring. However, you're going to want to aggregate your behavior scores up to the account level. And usually what I recommend doing is looking not just at aggregate behavior, aggregate engagement or aggregate behaviors, but also break that out by roles, right? When you're talking about ABM, typically you're thinking about buying committees, right? You want to make sure you're covering all the right, you're getting all the right personas, all the right decision makers, and you're getting a certain level of activity or level of engagement with them. And so in order, like, those two things, in my mind, they don't, it's not one or the other. You have to put them together in order to make ABM work. And actually, there was a comment in there by Jomar. Engagio uses time-based behavior score. That's absolutely true, right? Like, how many touches within the last 7 days, how many touches within the last 30 days. And actually, you could add the persona level to it and get add persona level of scoring to it so that you get kind of more rich behavioral scoring as well.
Elliot also asked, what do you think is the best or like most statistically significant way to aggregate behavior scores if you're going to do account scoring? Is it just summing them up, or an average, or weighting it by different title types or something like that?
I would say average is probably not something I would go with, but summing them up and by different personas or title types is probably the way to go. And you can do this. So I've done this before in a combination of using kind of the data that's captured in Engagio and passing that through to Marketo and doing a lot of that calculation in Marketo. But obviously there's specialized tools that you can employ as well, not the least of which is a CDP that allows you a better way to aggregate behavior or engagement across a single account. Any other questions? All right, so let's move on to the last piece of this. 55% of MOPsPROs have no access to any multi-touch attribution capabilities, and 33% still report primarily out of spreadsheets. I'm actually not entirely surprised by that, especially the, I was a little surprised that as many people, like 40-some% of the people have multi-touch attribution capabilities of some sort. I thought that was higher than I expected. 33%, while I mentioned it's definitely an issue, right? That means a third of us can't make full use of our data. It's also not surprising given kind of what I've seen out there. So the key, technology is the key to fully activating your data. Why is that, right? We talked about this earlier as well, right? There's a lot of sales behavior activity. In Salesforce, you've got your events object, you got your tasks object. They make up kind of the activities data from your sales teams, right? And it's kind of hard to tap into that, especially when you don't have the right tools. And it's definitely hard to tap into that when you want to do things like, hey, you know what? I don't necessarily have the cleanest lifecycle processing in place. So I wanted to see whether or not a salesperson reaches out, emails or calls one of our MQLs within a reasonable amount of time, let's say within SLA. That's not something that easily comes out of the box within Salesforce. You can kind of hack it together, but it's difficult, right? Marketo is another instance, and most marketing automation platforms, as a matter of fact, some of the richest data that you have is going to be the activities data. You attempt to bring that to light and bring that to the surface by doing things like behavioral scoring, by doing things like persona scoring or role scoring and whatnot. However, there's a lot of data that's untapped, right? And so, what we see here is that generally speaking, the people that are highly data driven tend to eventually migrate over to something that is a little more robust, as you can see here, right? People that are highly data driven, whether it's behavior scored or whether it's based on behavior score or based on self-reported data-driven, status, right? For people that are behavior scored as very data-driven, they're 5.4 times as likely to have a traditional BI stack. People that are somewhat data-driven were 2.3 times as likely to have a traditional BI stack. People that were self-reported as data-driven were 2.9, almost 3 times as likely to have a traditional BI stack. Now, that's not to say a traditional BI stack is the end all be all, right? All that means is that eventually people reach a point, and I think many of you probably have seen as well, right? Eventually you reach a point where doing reporting out of either Marketo or Salesforce or spreadsheets, exporting, lead and contact reports out of Salesforce, exporting a lead list out of Marketo just really doesn't cut it, because there's only so much information that you can bring to surface without tapping into some of the other data that's being collected. And so that's kind of a natural progression. And one other thing I want to call out is that, if you look at this and use attribution as kind of a North Star, right? We want to have some level of multi-touch attribution, ideally, to really fully realize the value and potential marketing. Well, people that have a traditional BI stack are 2.6 times as likely to also have attribution capabilities. Now, that's not to say, the traditional BI stack is kind of the way to enable attribution, although you can do that, right? I've written a blog about how you can get attribution, maybe not the anonymous to known attribution, but known to close attribution you can get using just Salesforce data and the right tools. That's not necessarily, like that the BI stack is the prerequisite for that. However, I will say that what I've seen is that many people will get a tool like Visible, for example, and you use kind of the UI for attribution reporting, which is great to start. However, Visible even, especially kind of given the limitations of the UI, it starts, you start running into blockers around the utility of that tool. And many people start eventually evolve into kind of a hybrid of using Visible as to just primarily collect data, while using more of a traditional BI stack to really dive into the insights and the analysis that they're looking for. And so that's kind of a trend that I've seen. And so that's what I believe, that my hypothesis as to what's driving kind of this correlation you see here. And so it's not just me saying it, right? Like, once again, going back to the comments for some of the pain points that many of you guys are seeing: disconnected data, disparate data sources, manual processes that it takes to consolidate different data into cohesive, coherent, digestible reporting for analysis. Now, most of these can be resolved, or at least you could be well on your way to resolving it with some sort of a marketing intelligence tool, whether it's kind of a specialized tool like a full circle insights, or something that's kind of more akin to your traditional BI stack. The point is to bring all of this data to a central repository of some sort and tap into it so that you can do some of the slicing and dicing, do some of the calculations that really exposes the power of your data. And so, not surprisingly, overcoming these blockers to activating your data is going to be largely around technology investments. I'm going to pause here. Any questions?
Rich had a good question about, I think is a new job role that we're coining about being a data sheriff. Do you want to ask your question, Rich?
Yeah, sure, Eric. So one of the struggles we have is you've got so many different data inputs, right, from around the organization. Your sales organization wants one thing, your marketing organization wants another thing, their product is bringing another thing. And it's having someone to kind of manage data governance across all of these different platforms so that you've got a schema. And like, we've always done that kind of as a committee. And if several people own it, that means nobody owns it, and who gets to trump whom. So I'm trying to think of something like a data sheriff, right? That's the term that Sydney was talking about. Where do you see something like that living in a MOPsPROs organization? Does that have to be a dedicated individual with that being their only role, or can that be divided up?
So from an organizational standpoint, I don't think there's a right answer to this. However, my personal bias is that this probably sits best within marketing. And let me tell you why I think that. Marketing tends to, outside of product, marketing tends to have the most complex, varied, and diverse data that I've seen, right? Like Salesforce is Salesforce, 90% of the data that you need sits in Salesforce and has a pretty consistent data model. And the architecture itself is a decent, not foolproof, but a decent governance to kind of keeping your data in check. Your product data, it's going to be hard to, like, you're not going to have anything more complex than product, except marketing, right? And the reason marketing is more, in my opinion, more complex is because you have multiple channels, multiple offers, multiple platforms that do the same thing, that do different things. You've got audience, channel, offer considerations, and you need to find a way to stitch it all together. And so because of that, I tend to think marketing is kind of in the best position. And marketing also needs to understand product. Marketing needs to understand the product data. Why? Because we're triggering your customer nurture, your post-sales nurture off of, some of the data points that's coming out of the product, right? And so it behooves you to understand kind of the end-to-end of that. Now, where that person sits officially, right, is going to depend on the organization, but I tend to think marketing is kind of in the best position to hit the ground running, just because of, generally speaking, the varied level of experience and data we're exposed to.
Do you think that's something that someone could accomplish in a part-time role, or is that almost something that you're dedicated? This is your job. Here's your data sheriff star. That's all you do.
I actually don't think that person would be as effective in a 100% data sheriff or data governance role. Why is that? Because part of what makes MOPS professionals and SOPs professionals good at our jobs is that we touch multiple systems, and as a result, we understand multiple systems, and we understand how the data flows into and out of the multiple systems. And so I think disconnecting yourself from that and doing just kind of a specialized role in data governance, that kind of turns you into a project manager, and you actually end up losing, right? Like there's nothing wrong with being a project manager, but you lose some of the depth of the data. And so I would say the ideal, data sheriff would actually be still at least 30% in the systems on a day-to-day, so that they can effectively kind of run that governance. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thanks for the insight.
Yeah, no problem. Any other questions? Build something. Decentralized versus centralized fields. I'm not sure I understand what the question is.
I think that was related to an answer about Rich's data share question about automating that in a way.
Got it. Cool. All right, moving on. So we're on to the conclusion. I've got a couple of key things. Now, building a data-driven organization, it's not like, I wish I could say there's some like aha moment here. I don't think any of this is anything that that all of us don't know implicitly, right? Now we do see the data that kind of shows some of these pieces here, but first and foremost, I would say, in building a data-driven organization is kind of going back to the first thing that I was saying earlier, which is start small. Individual actionable insights and specific recommendations. Don't try to boil the ocean. Don't try to build like a huge, elaborate funnel, even if you have the data to do it, right? Because especially if you're trying to change the organization, you're trying to change the culture, typically, starting with kind of baby steps on, hey, this is one change you can do, tends to, in my experience, get better buy-off and a kind of more long-term momentum. But really, at the end of the day, this is kind of, like you kind of have to take this in steps, right? Start small, but the idea is that you want to evolve the culture enough to being data-driven so that you can start investing. Because really, at the end of the day, what I'm seeing based on the results that we're seeing, the responses, as well as the data that it's showing up, you can't really fully be data-driven without investing in people and technology. Right? And so don't put off hiring or training your first marketing analyst, and make sure you give them the right tools to activate your marketing data, because it doesn't make sense that we're going out and buying a lot of third-party data when there's that's not to say you shouldn't be investing in enrichment and all of that, right? But most of us have this wealth of data that our prospects and our customers are giving us and telling us that we're just not making full utilization of. And I would say that activating that would generally be cheaper and more time efficient than spending a whole lot of money on even more enrichment. I've seen some people with multiple enrichment systems in place because they need that little extra bit of information to drive some of the decisions and some of the triggers that they're kicking off. I would say first, make sure you're utilizing all first-party data that you have effectively. And I will say, actually, it's not just me saying that, right? Because one of the questions, if you recall, that we had in the survey is, where do you see marketing intelligence headed in the next 3 years? Some of you interpreted that, and that's okay. Some of you interpreted that as, where do you see marketing intelligence in your organization heading in the next few years? Some of you were more like kind of thinking in terms of what the vision is for the practice as a whole, right? But really, if you look at some of these comments, it really doesn't diverge too much from what we've already discussed, right? What are we looking for in the next 3 years, whether you call it wishful thinking or hopeful thinking, from a culture shift perspective? And these I had to, by the way, I had to kind of paraphrase because some of these got a little long, so they're not exact quotes, but culture shift being a key cog in wheel for business decisions, right? Really using the data that we have to drive business decisions is kind of my interpretation of that. Cross-functional marketing and sales intelligence, alignment. More companies will pay attention to marketing intelligence, culture, mission critical status within the C-suite. Like all of those themes really coalesce into what I'm calling culture shift, right? What we're trying to do in marketing intelligence discipline is to get people to be more data driven. What we're trying to do is to get executives, to get leadership to pay more attention to the data. Not just that, right? Also kind of across the organization to use data, because we have so much of it and so rich that could potentially be helping the organization. People investment. So data scientists will continue to have a larger role in providing analysis and strategic insight, hiring marketing and sales analysts to provide greater insights. Hope it'll be commonplace to have data engineers working within marketing, increase to a full-time in-house resource, more dedicated headcount to this function, right? Like very similar theme. And that's kind of, if you juxtapose that against the data that we saw, as well as some of the comments around the pain points, you'll start seeing patterns emerge, right? What is the pain point? We don't have enough people. We don't have enough specialized skill sets around data and data engineering. Okay, what do I hope for? Data scientists, more analysts, more line analysts, and specialized data engineers to help us bring it all together, right? So it's not me saying that we need to invest in people, it's you really saying that we need to invest in the people. Technology, we just talked about that, right? A lot of the technology, like you need that technology in order to make the full use of your data, especially things like that kind of run on the back end that we all know is there, but we don't necessarily make full use of, right? Tools for aggregating marketing performance data from multiple sources, bigger investment by MAPs to cater to marketing intelligence, more API-driven dashboards, need for centralized data warehouses, ownership of data streaming from our tech stack, right? You see the theme there, which is we have a lot of MarTech, we have a lot of disparate data sources we need to bring together to stitch together that story. And clearly, many of us are seeing this pain. And so part of that, you know, culture, once you get momentum in that culture shift, it's really like hitting the ground with the people investment and the technology investment so that you can become data driven. Because first, you got to have the will, right? The political will and kind of the need and the want to be more data driven. But once you're there, once you kind of have that buy-in, there's a lot that you need to invest in getting the skill sets as well as the tools in place. And finally, there's kind of that next step, the more of the future-looking piece here. A lot of comments around AI, artificial intelligence, data science, custom data science, these scoring models, artificial intelligence with predictive technology. And that's, I think, the logical progression, right? That's where we're all looking to head more sooner rather than later. But really at the day, the reason why I included it in here, but it's kind of that last bullet is, in order to make full use of AI, in order to make full use of data science capabilities, even if you have a data scientist, and I've seen people make this mistake a lot, which is don't have your infrastructure in order, you don't have the right data fidelity or the right data precision or data cleanliness to really start building models that are useful, and you rush into hiring data scientists, they'll end up sitting there twiddling their thumbs much of the time, or spending a lot of their time corralling data from multiple sources, cleaning data, and that's, you know, data scientists are expensive. That's not necessarily the best use of their time. And so really, we need to make sure we've got this foundation, right, in place, that kind of the core culture, people investment, technology investment, before we really start diving headfirst into data science. Unless, of course, you're talking about, you know, hiring a third-party firm or a third-party tool to help you facilitate that. But even then, if you don't have good data to back it up, garbage in, garbage out. That's true for regular analytics. It's true for data science. It's true for artificial intelligence as well. Okay, I've done a lot of talking. That's all I've got for you. I've got a couple of examples of, you know, I talked about starting small and getting into very specific insights. At the end of this, in the appendix, I have a couple of examples of what I mean by that. I'm not going to go into that. I want to save the last few minutes for any final questions we have.
We did have some chatter in the chat, and also a few questions that came in on the form ahead of time about tools for MOPs. What tools specifically you would recommend? I know that a lot of that is very dependent on what your goals are, but we had specific questions around tools for building a data pipeline or tools for doing full funnel reporting outside of just Marketo and Salesforce. You mentioned earlier having a data lake or a data repository of some sort. Is there anything in particular that you recommend?
Yeah, there are any number of things, any number of tools I would recommend. I'm going to switch to a different deck because there's a slide that I want to show that is probably going to illustrate this a lot better than I can explain kind of freehand here. So if you'll bear with me for a second.
Sure, no problem.
So from the tool set perspective, there are a number of tools that are important in building kind of, and this is kind of more of your traditional BI stack, right? Most people start and end with visualization, right? Hey, I have Tableau, what can I do with it? Hey, I have Looker, what can I do with it? Power BI, what can I do with it? The problem is, in order for Tableau, Power BI, and whatever's to provide, you know, the real insights that you're looking for, there's a lot that happens behind the scenes. So Sydney, you mentioned data pipeline. We've obviously been talking about data repositories, prep. These aren't the end all be all solutions. These are just examples, right? But really, 4 key things that you need in building a marketing intelligence stack, or a traditional BI stack, if you will, a data pipeline. And the purpose of the pipeline is to get the data from your source systems into a centralized repository. A data store, which is your repository. That's where you kind of manipulate your data, you stitch it together. Prep, usually the prep tools are kind of built into either the visualization or the store, but there are specialized tools for that as well. And then finally, visualization, right? And so I would say of these 4 pillars, you need at least 3 of them. Typically, it's going to be data pipeline, data store, and visualization, because prep is kind of optional. If you have more complex scenarios, you might want a specialized data prep tool. There are some, like, depending on kind of where you are from an IT infrastructure, marketing intelligence infrastructure perspective, you might be able to find one of these tools and plug and play, right? And it fit into a gap that, that you have and kind of complete the picture. There are some tools out there you see on the bottom. I've worked with Caliber Mine as well as Domo before, where they kind of have the ability to pipe, store, and visualize data all in one, which is kind of useful. Right? And so, especially if you're a smaller company looking to start out in investing in marketing intelligence stack, you might want to consider that as opposed to kind of a piecemealing solution together. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think that's great. Julie had a question also about the survey itself. Which were the common attribution model systems that you used in the survey?
The common attribution system. Sorry,
Julie,
I'm not sure.
If you want to unmute yourself and clarify.
Yeah,
a little bit,
sorry. My question is, what are the common attribution model systems that people have been using?
Oh, yeah. So hold on one second. I don't think I have the details here, but if you recall, I think it was 45% of us had multi-touch attribution, and, or I'm sorry, hold on one sec. I had it in here.
Yeah. Specifically, the actual technology systems. Is it Marketo RCE, maybe lean data, the attribution model?
We didn't ask that question specifically.
Okay.
Yeah.
What have you been seeing?
Well, so there are a couple of common scenarios I've seen, right? Visible, obviously. I would typically recommend Visible if you have a heavy paid media investment. And the reason for that is because you need to be able to justify the cost. And Visible's specialty really is around tracking the anonymous to known path. Otherwise, you could use, Salesforce data, Marketo data to build attribution models, as long as you have the right BI stack in place as well. And so those are kind of the common paths that I see. Lean data obviously has attribution capabilities, as well as a couple of other tools. But I think the common ones I see are going to be Visible and a traditional BI stack, or a combination of the two.
Cool. We are out of time. Thank you so much for all of the questions, everyone, and for participating. We'll send out a recording in the next few days, so you'll be able to go back and reference this. And if you have any other questions for Eric that you weren't able to get to, he's also in the MOPsPROs Slack group, so feel free to tag him in a question in one of the channels so everyone can see. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day.